Hey everyone, ErikOnPaper, and I'm Eric. So, I've been getting a lot of requests in my Spider Man 4 series for Vulture and Mysterio, and I've heard your requests, and I'm going to be drawing Mysterio today. And this scene is actually going to be in the film, as you'll see. Mysterio is one of the villains that appears really early in our film as part of the opening montage, and what we tried to do with each of these villains is give them their own really cool vignette or flavor, and in this case, we're going to see Spider-Man trapped in one of Mysterio's illusions, and I wanted to illustrate how that would actually appear in our film. So basically, in the film, Spider-Man is going to fight Mysterio, and Mysterio is going to appear gigantic with all these boxes, crates. They're fighting in a warehouse, but they're going to be swirling around him, and Mysterio will be hurling them as projectiles at Spider-Man, and he's going to be leaping from projectile to projectile, like box to box, and eventually will end up in Mysterio's palm. And I decided to go with brush inking for this because I first off need to get better at brush inking, and especially because I wanted to get the clouds just right, and it's harder to do with a pen. When Bryn was explaining the sequence to me, and when I read the script and I saw it featured a giant Mysterio and Spider-Man in a swirling vortex, it made me think actually of two different video games like we're combining together. The first being the PlayStation 1 Spider-Man game, which I played endlessly as a kid, and featured a giant Mysterio as one of the bosses. Bryn hadn't played this, of course, but when I showed him a Let's Play of it, he immediately said, "Yeah, that's it." And if any of you have played Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, there's a really early level, I believe, with um, Sandman, where you're in a giant sand tornado and you have to jump from box to box. So the sequence is going to kind of be like that. It's really going to showcase a lot of high quality CGI and effects with Spider-Man leaping and being acrobatic. And the funny thing is, with Quentin Beck being, in the comics at least, they changed it up a lot for Spider-Man Far From Home. And by the way, I love the design of Mysterio in that movie, but we're keeping it more the traditional Quentin Beck character. Anyway, I got sidetracked. What I was going to say was that with Quentin Beck being a Hollywood special effects artist, this will probably be one of the more complicated sequences in the movie with a ton of particles and visual elements that need to be rendered. So I hope that somewhere the irony gods are smiling down on us. Now, just talking about the drawing of the piece, what I'm doing here is using a white gel pen to get highlights and make it a little more graphic in design. I'm not a big fan of when things just fade off into shadow or complete blackness. I just tend to prefer there be just visual representations of a separation of elements. So I just go in and add some rim lighting to his gloves and other bits that I deem appropriate. And while it's fun to work this way, ultimately you can take it too far, so I've had to learn restraint. And now I'm just going in and adding a whole bunch of feathering and detailing. If you're an artist and feeling like you've had not the best day, or something just isn't working out, adding a whole bunch of feathering, detailing, and line work is a good way I found actually to get aggression and anger up. It still makes something cool. You're not doing anything destructive, but as some of my pieces look extra moody, or like, whoa, you put a ton of detailing into that. Well, probably wasn't having the best day. And a fun fact about Mysterio, how he was storyboarded to appear in the Raimi film. Yes, storyboards do exist and have been released of the film, and those from very early on, Bryn said, and I agree, that we have to follow through with and make it recreate as faithfully as possible in our own film. And the storyboard artist drew Mysterio unmasked as Bruce Campbell. Now, of course, Mr. Campbell's not going to be in our movie, sadly, but I'm not even sure if it was confirmed he actually was going to be Mysterio. But somehow, if anybody knows Bruce Campbell and he's interested in doing this, I would love to work with him one day. But I digress. So now we're going into the coloring stage, and I chose to do this piece digitally, namely because the ink that I use it doesn't work well with the Copic markers. The alcohol reactivates the ink, and you just end with this kind of gray muddiness that isn't really too appealing unless you're doing a really dingy piece, which this isn't. I really wanted to make it pop. And while working on this piece, I realized that with both Shocker and Mysterio, I had done villains with underlighting, so the next video that I do, which is going to be the Vulture, I'm going to be sure to change it up to give you guys a bit of a variety. Now, what I'm doing in is adding the highlights and the transfer mode. I like to use the lasso tool and then the gradient tool, and I have the colors set on screen at 65% opacity, and that just does a really good job of brightening everything up, but not seeming too inorganic. And when coloring as well as inking, you have to keep the texture of the objects in mind. In the case I wanted the cloth to look like cloth, and his pin, I'm not sure exactly what it's called, wants to be metal. And yeah, well, as Spider-Man calls it, his fishbowl, but basically his helmet, it has to be reflective, so I'm adding green highlights from the environment. And later on, I'm going to add purple from his cape bouncing up on his helmet to give it a little bit more of a realistic appearance. And a trick when doing a character that is predominantly green is to vary the greens, and not only in texture but in color. So the greens that I flatted with are slightly different than the greens of his costume, and the highlight color I've chosen is different than the highlight color on his body. And when you're going in for the texture, I wanted to make his gauntlets look very metallic. So I just go in and add a whole bunch of highlights. Like, very rarely, if ever, do you paint in shadows. I mean, you can, of course, but the way I was taught and the way I tend to go with is to paint in light, essentially. So as you can see, I'm working on the edges and the rims where I didn't do any of the inking and shading to give it a raised effect, and that helps it pop out from the rest of the body because the eye tends to go to lighter elements first. Now I know I talked a lot about the CGI in the sequence to create the vortex and the boxes, and Spidey will be digital just because of the impossible gymnastics involved. And one of the things, though, is that we want to keep as much real as possible. So Mysterio will be a man in a suit, and a lot of it is going to be 3D printed from a design created by VFX Fowler. We're going to keep as close to the classic design as possible. Oh, and another important tip here in designing the sequence, not only for this drawing but for the film, is that Mysterio is made up of secondary colors, like your purples and your greens, and Spider-Man is on primary colors, and this is going to help really distinguish the geography of the scene where Spider-Man, our hero, is going to be, and that's where we want our main focus. Like, even in this drawing, we're going to spot Spidey in Mysterio's hand so his detail isn't lost. Now what I'm doing here is called a color hold. It's similar to the effect I did for Shocker's lightning and energy effects, but I really wanted to sell the texture on Mysterio's helmet, and what I'm doing here is going over the black ink lines on a new layer in Photoshop and just making those different highlights than uh, the rest of the drawing, because I wanted, while still preserving the ink lines that I put in there, I wanted to give it just a very glassy, very surreal effect. And I'm going to be doing something similar to the clouds to give it a different effect entirely of, being gas. And getting back to the film, the Mysterio sequence, while brief, is going to be exciting and memorable, and it ends on a really funny note that I am not going to spoil here, but I am really looking forward to shooting that scene. I know it's going to get a big laugh from the audience. And then I just like to go back in with a alpha mask and erase the ink lines underneath so the line holds can really pop and stand out. And then just add a blue highlight or a side light to help the hand and other elements stand out. And here's the completed Mysterio drawing. Yeah, this piece was pretty cool. I like doing the brushwork and the cross hatching. And next time on the Spider-Man 4 series, I am drawing the Vulture. And, please like and subscribe and ask as many questions as you want about Spider-Man 4. I'll say that I was just talking with Brent about when we can possibly begin our shooting, and we are thinking at the very earliest when Washington State hits Phase 3, we're going to start shooting Spider-Man against green screen because it'll just need to be Brand as Spider-Man and everyone's wearing masks and keeping their distance. So thank you for watching, and remember to keep telling your stories.